It was a normal morning, the kind where nothing feels out of the ordinary. The sun had just started to climb over the rooftops, and the soft hum of the city beginning to wake up filled the air. The protagonist of this story, a person who always prided themselves on keeping things in order, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand. They had a stack of bills to review, a part of the weekly routine that usually felt mundane but necessary. This week, however, something would shatter that routine completely. They picked up the envelope from the electric company, its bulk a little heavier than usual. Usually it was just a thin piece of paper, nothing more. The protagonist slid the bill out, expecting the familiar figure they had come to anticipate each month. But this time what greeted them made their stomach drop. The number at the bottom of the page was so high it seemed impossible. $5,000. It stared at them like a cruel joke. $5,000 for electricity used in a modest home. The mind raced. Surely there must be a mistake. The protagonist rubbed their eyes, thinking perhaps they were seeing things. The disbelief quickly turned into action. First, they checked the previous bills, comparing month to month. Their usage had been consistent, normal for a home of their size and the season. Nothing had spiked, nothing had changed. The numbers didn't add up, not in any conceivable way. Panic and frustration began to mix with the confusion. How could this happen? What could cause such an astronomical increase overnight? The mind ran through every possibility. A broken appliance, a massive leak, some new meter system gone wrong. But nothing seemed plausible. Determined to find answers, the protagonist picked up the phone and called the electric company. The line rang and rang, the hold music playing over and over as the minutes ticked by. Every time they thought someone would finally answer, the music would loop again, mocking their growing impatience. Finally, a voice came on the line, tired and scripted, repeating lines as if it had been programmed to say the same thing to hundreds of frustrated customers every hour. They explained the situation calmly, stating clearly that there had to be a mistake. The response was a standard apology, a vague suggestion that someone would look into it, and an assurance that it would be handled. But the words felt empty. The protagonist could sense the bureaucracy moving slowly, uncaringly, as if their $5,000 problem was insignificant. Hours passed, and still, there was no resolution. The protagonist documented everything, writing down meter readings, the amount of electricity typically used, and comparing it to the bill. They took photos of the meter, cross-checked with past months, and even looked at the electric company's website to see if any announcements had been made about rate changes or errors. Nothing. Every piece of evidence pointed to one conclusion. The bill was completely wrong. Frustration mounted. How could a company make such a colossal mistake and then act as if it were no big deal? The protagonist felt anger rising, not just at the error itself but at the helplessness imposed by the system. It seemed that no matter what evidence they presented, the process was too slow, too rigid, too indifferent to care about the reality of their situation. And then a thought began to take shape. If the company would not listen, if they were blind to the mistake, maybe it was time for the protagonist to find another way to make them see. The idea was bold, maybe even risky, but the sense of injustice burned too brightly to ignore. The day continued with the protagonist pacing, thinking, planning, and imagining what could be done. Friends and family were called, though carefully, without revealing all the details, just enough to express the frustration and disbelief. Each call brought empathy, shared outrage, and suggestions ranging from practical to extreme. The protagonist listened quietly, knowing they had to find the right balance between taking action and staying safe. They couldn't just react impulsively, not when the stakes felt so high. $5,000 was not just a number. It was a weight pressing down, and it needed to be lifted. In the midst of the day, there were moments of doubt. What if this backfired? What if the company retaliated legally? What if their neighbors or friends didn't understand and judgment came their way? These thoughts collided with the desire for fairness and resolution. The protagonist knew this wasn't just about money. It was about standing up, about proving that mistakes, no matter how large, cannot be ignored. They also realized that doing nothing would only embolden the company, allowing them to assume that customers would simply pay whatever was demanded without question. As night fell, the protagonist reviewed all the evidence once again. They looked at meter readings, past bills, the company's rates, and customer service interactions. Each piece of information reinforced the impossibility of the charge. It wasn't just a little mistake, it was an error of staggering proportions. And the more they thought about it, the clearer it became that waiting for the company to act in their own time was not an option. Action had to be taken carefully, deliberately, and with all the facts in hand. Sleep came fitfully, with dreams filled with flashing numbers, meters, and the company's indifferent voices. Yet even in rest, the mind was turning, plotting, considering every angle. The protagonist was no stranger to challenges, and this was just another problem to solve, albeit one that required courage and creativity. By morning, they had a plan forming in the back of their mind, not fully fleshed out but strong enough to bring a sense of purpose and direction. There was a way to make the company realize the seriousness of their error, to ensure they could not ignore it, and to reclaim control of the situation. The next day began with renewed determination. The protagonist gathered more evidence, creating a clear record of the bills, readings, and inconsistencies. Every detail was documented meticulously, every possibility considered. They were preparing not only for confrontation but also for accountability, making sure that when the time came, their actions would be justified and grounded in undeniable proof. Throughout the day, the protagonist felt a mix of emotions: anger, fear, hope, and a growing sense of empowerment. They understood the stakes, but they also understood the importance of asserting themselves in the face of such blatant oversight. The idea that one individual could stand up to a massive, impersonal company and demand fairness gave them a quiet strength. Each passing hour reinforced the need for action, and each document, photo, and record became a piece of armor in the coming confrontation. By evening, the protagonist was ready. The plan was still in its early stages, but the foundation was solid. They knew the next steps would require courage, careful timing, and attention to detail. The mistakes of the electric company had created an opportunity, not just to correct a wrong, but to make a statement. And for the first time since discovering the $5,000 bill, the protagonist felt a sense of control returning, a sense that they could influence the outcome instead of being swept along helplessly by it. As the sun set and the city lights flickered on, the protagonist sat quietly, reviewing everything once more. Each number, each call, each note was carefully laid out. They understood that the journey ahead would be intense and perhaps chaotic, but they were no longer paralyzed by disbelief. The shock of the $5,000 bill had transformed into a determination to act, to reclaim control, and to confront the madness with a clear mind and a steady heart. The stage was set, the evidence prepared, and the protagonist was ready for the next chapter of this real-life drama, where they would no longer be a passive victim of an outrageous mistake, but an active force demanding justice. The morning sun had barely broken through the clouds when the protagonist woke, still thinking about the impossible bill. Sleep had brought some rest, but no answers. The plan that had begun to form the night before now needed careful attention. They knew the next step had to be thorough, deliberate, and cautious. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about principle, fairness, and making sure their voice could not be ignored. The first thing they did was review every detail once again. Meter readings were compared against past months. Electricity usage was charted, and every anomaly was carefully noted. The protagonist even started logging hourly usage, checking each appliance in the house to make sure nothing could account for such a massive spike. Every calculation reaffirmed the truth. There was no way their home had used electricity that would justify a $5,000 bill. The numbers told a simple story, but the electric company seemed blind to it. Once satisfied with the evidence, the protagonist began researching the company's system. They read through forums where other customers shared similar experiences, learning about meter errors, billing mistakes, and the way the company handled complaints. There were stories of endless waiting, dismissals, and even people being charged for months of errors. This gave the protagonist both context and a sense of urgency. They were not the only one, but they did not want to suffer like the others who had been ignored for months. A careful plan began to take shape. The protagonist considered every angle: how to confront the company, how to prove the error, and if necessary, how to take action that would force acknowledgement. They knew it had to be smart, not reckless. They had read too many stories of people making hasty moves and getting into trouble. The key was preparation, documentation, and timing. Throughout the morning, they made lists of everything needed: photographs of the meter, Logs of electricity use, copies of past bills, and detailed notes of every interaction with the company. Each piece was like a puzzle piece that, when put together, would tell a story impossible to ignore. They also started noting legal and safety considerations. Any action they planned had to stay within the law and avoid putting anyone at risk. They understood that even the most justified action could become a problem if it wasn't handled carefully. The protagonist then reached out to a few trusted friends, sharing the situation without giving away the details of the planned action. They wanted perspective, not advice on taking extreme measures. The conversations were reassuring. Friends encouraged persistence, reminded them to keep calm, and offered support for following through with legitimate methods. There was comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their frustration, even if the friends didn't fully understand the scale of the problem. As the day went on, the protagonist walked through the house, checking every appliance, noting how long lights had been on, how often the heater had been used, and whether anything could possibly have caused such a spike. Nothing added up. The heater had been used sparingly. Lights and electronics were on timers, and even the kitchen appliances could not account for more than a few $100s in usage at most. The impossibility of the bill became even clearer, solidifying their determination. They also began imagining the moment they would confront the company. Not in anger or rashness, but with a calm and confident presentation of the facts. They pictured themselves sitting across from a representative, showing the logs, the readings, and every calculation. They knew that when the truth was undeniable, there could be no escape. Yet part of them also wondered if that would be enough. The company had a reputation for bureaucracy and delay, and sometimes truth alone was not enough to make change happen quickly. By evening, the protagonist began considering contingency measures. They thought about ways to gently, safely, and legally make an impact that would show the company their mistake could not be ignored. Every scenario was weighed: pros, cons, risks, and potential fallout. They knew it was a delicate balance. Any misstep could escalate into trouble, but careful planning could create a solution that demanded attention. They felt the tension of responsibility, but also a surge of determination. This was their problem to solve, and they intended to solve it. As night fell, they reviewed everything once more. The evidence was clear, the plan was forming, and their resolve was stronger than ever. The protagonist understood that this was more than a battle over a bill. It was a test of patience, intelligence, and courage. They realized that standing up to a large, impersonal company required not just anger but clarity and strategic thinking. Hours passed in quiet preparation. The protagonist went through each document, each photo, and each note repeatedly. They wrote a timeline of events detailing every call made, every interaction, and every observation. It was meticulous work, and it consumed the evening, but it was necessary. The foundation had to be solid. Once action was taken, there could be no mistakes. Finally, as the clock neared midnight, the protagonist paused, taking a deep breath. They looked around the quiet house, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. The thought of confronting the electric company, of making them acknowledge a massive mistake, was daunting, but the preparation gave them confidence. They knew that when the moment came, they could act with both courage and clarity. The protagonist also considered the broader impact of their actions. They were aware that friends, neighbors, and even strangers might be watching if the story reached the public eye. They wanted to make sure that the approach was respectful, lawful, and focused entirely on the truth. The idea was not to embarrass the company unnecessarily, but to assert fairness and accountability in a situation where the company had failed spectacularly. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, the protagonist felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The previous shock of seeing the $5,000 bill had faded, replaced by a clear sense of purpose. They were ready to move forward, to take calculated steps, and to ensure that justice, or at least acknowledgement of the truth, would be achieved. This day would mark the beginning of a bold, careful response that would challenge the company in ways they never expected. With a final review of all evidence and plans, the protagonist finally allowed themselves a moment of rest. The house was quiet, the city slowly coming to life outside, and the world seemed to hold its breath along with them. The next stage was ready to begin, and the protagonist was prepared to face whatever came next with a combination of careful planning, courage, and unwavering determination. The groundwork had been laid, and now the action would follow, bringing with it challenges, surprises, and the promise of a story that would be remembered for its audacity and intelligence. The day had finally arrived when the protagonist felt ready to act. Every detail had been checked, every meter reading and past bill logged, every call to the company documented. They had reviewed their plan countless times, weighing risks and outcomes. The morning sun streamed through the windows, but inside the house there was a sense of focused calm. The protagonist knew that the steps they were about to take would require careful attention, but they also felt a sense of empowerment. They were no longer helpless in the face of an impossible bill. The first action was simple in concept but critical in execution. The protagonist ensured that all safety measures were in place before beginning. Electrical systems could be dangerous, and they respected that risk. They checked circuits, ensured that appliances were safely powered down, and confirmed that there would be no harm to themselves or anyone else. Preparation was not just about strategy. It was about responsibility. Once everything was in place, the protagonist carefully executed the first stage of the plan. The power to the house was managed, turning off specific circuits in a way that would safely reduce electricity flow without causing damage. Each step was deliberate, methodical, and measured. As the final switch was adjusted, there was a moment of tension. This was the point of no return, and the protagonist felt a surge of adrenaline. They had prepared for this moment for days, and now it was here. Within minutes, the effects became apparent. The electric company's monitoring systems picked up on the unusual activity. Alerts were triggered, and the company's automated systems began sending messages and initiating protocols. The protagonist watched quietly, noting each reaction, each phone call, and each notification. There was a sense of satisfaction in seeing that their careful planning was working exactly as intended. The chaos was unfolding on the company's end, and they were observing it safely from a distance. Soon, a representative arrived at the house. The protagonist greeted them calmly, explaining that they had noticed a major discrepancy in their bill and wanted to understand what had happened. The representative seemed flustered, checking devices, running diagnostics, and making calls to supervisors. It was clear that the company was unprepared for such an immediate response. The protagonist remained patient, providing information only when asked, letting the evidence speak for itself. Every meter reading, every past bill, and every calculation was ready to show the truth. Neighbors began to notice the activity as well. Some were curious, some concerned, and some whispered about what might be happening. The protagonist kept interactions polite and minimal, focusing on the matter at hand. They knew that speculation could spread quickly, but they also knew that maintaining calm and composure was critical. The goal was not to create panic or embarrassment, but to demand accountability. As the representative worked, tension built on both sides. The company's team seemed increasingly frustrated, realizing that the situation was more complex than they had anticipated. They checked systems, questioned each reading, and double-checked protocols. The protagonist watched quietly, knowing that every moment of confusion for the company reinforced the validity of their case. They had acted with care, responsibility, and logic, and the company's scramble was a direct result of their error. Meanwhile, the protagonist documented everything in real time. Photos, notes, and timestamps were carefully recorded. This documentation was not only for personal satisfaction, but also to ensure that there could be no dispute about the legitimacy of the actions taken. It was a thorough, methodical process, and the protagonist remained composed throughout. Each step was deliberate, reinforcing the point that they were not acting recklessly but strategically. Hours passed with the company trying to restore normal operations while checking for errors. The protagonist observed, noting each interaction, each call, and each adjustment. There was a strange mix of tension and satisfaction. It was tense because the situation was unpredictable, but satisfying because the plan was having an impact. The company, which had seemed so untouchable, was now reacting visibly to the discrepancy they had created by simply being thorough and assertive. As the day continued, the representative finally acknowledged that there was indeed a problem. There was hesitation, attempts to downplay the severity, and questions about why it had escalated so quickly. The protagonist remained calm, presenting evidence clearly and methodically. They did not raise their voice or act impulsively. Instead, they relied on facts and preparation. Slowly, the company began to admit that the $5,000 bill was not justified. that an error had occurred, and that corrective measures were necessary. Outside observers, neighbors, and even a few passers-by began to take note of the unusual activity. Some were supportive, impressed by the protagonist's determination and composure. Others were curious, wondering why someone would take such bold steps. The protagonist didn't engage in gossip or explanation. They focused on the matter at hand. Their goal was resolution, and the outside world was simply a backdrop. By evening, the company had begun taking corrective action. Adjustments were made, notes were taken for internal review, and assurances were given that the error would be corrected promptly. The protagonist watched carefully, ensuring that promises were not empty words. They had prepared for a long process, but the careful execution of their plan had accelerated the resolution significantly. The company could not ignore the evidence, and the protagonist's measured, responsible approach had forced acknowledgement. The protagonist finally allowed themselves a moment of reflection. The intense day had been exhausting, but it was also empowering. They had taken control of a situation that had seemed impossible, acted responsibly, and forced accountability. It was not about revenge or anger. It was about fairness and standing up for oneself in the face of overwhelming odds. The satisfaction was quiet but profound. As night fell, the protagonist reviewed the day's events. Each step, each interaction, each careful observation was logged and considered. They knew that the immediate problem was being addressed, but they also recognized the importance of documenting the process for any future reference. The careful planning, execution, and documentation ensured that their actions were justified, clear, and responsible. The protagonist felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The first stage of the plan had succeeded beyond expectations, but they knew that the resolution was not yet complete. The company had acknowledged the error, but the final correction, the official apology, and the sense of closure were still to come. They were prepared to continue, to follow through with patience and vigilance, ensuring that the outcome matched the effort they had invested. By the end of the night, the protagonist sat quietly in the living room, lights dimmed, reflecting on the day. They realized that this experience had changed them. They had discovered a strength they hadn't fully appreciated, a capacity for careful, deliberate action in the face of an overwhelming challenge. The $5,000 bill had seemed like an impossible burden, but it had also become the catalyst for a test of patience, intelligence, and courage. The protagonist had passed that test and was ready for the next stage of the journey, knowing that the final resolution was within reach. The morning after the dramatic events of the previous day, the protagonist woke with a mixture of anticipation and fatigue. The first stage of the plan had gone exactly as intended, but now came the challenge of dealing with the aftermath. The company had begun acknowledging the error, but there was still the need to ensure that everything was corrected fully and officially. There were promises made, systems to adjust, and procedures to follow, and the protagonist knew that patience and careful attention would still be required. The first calls of the day were to the company. The protagonist remained calm, measured, and prepared with all documentation. They were ready to confirm that corrective actions were being implemented and that the $5,000 bill would be fully rectified. The representatives on the other end were more attentive than before, aware that the protagonist had proven both patience and knowledge. The protagonist carefully guided the conversations, asking clear questions, verifying details, and ensuring that every step was properly recorded. While dealing with the company, the protagonist also noticed reactions from neighbors. Some had heard of the unusual events and approached with curiosity and support. They shared stories of similar experiences with utilities, expressing admiration for the protagonist's courage and careful planning. The protagonist welcomed the interactions but remained focused. This was about resolution, not spectacle, and maintaining calm professionalism was key to achieving the desired outcome. Social media, unexpectedly, became a minor factor. Someone had noticed the unusual activity outside the house the previous day and shared it online. Comments poured in from people who had faced similar billing issues, offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes criticism. The protagonist observed quietly, noting the support and warnings but did not engage directly. They understood that the story could be amplified, and any public interaction had to be handled cautiously to avoid misunderstandings or escalation. The focus remained on resolving the issue with the company itself. Throughout the day, the company's teams continued investigating the cause of the error. The protagonist provided whatever information was needed, sharing meter readings, past bills, and usage logs. Each piece of evidence reinforced the truth and made the company's acknowledgement unavoidable. The representatives, now fully aware of the magnitude of the mistake, moved more decisively, adjusting systems, issuing corrections, and documenting the changes internally. The protagonist observed each step, ensuring that there would be no oversight or incomplete resolution. As the hours passed, the tension gradually began to ease. The protagonist could see progress, and the company's acknowledgement became more formal and thorough. Apologies were given, promises of refunds and corrected billing were made, and systems were adjusted to prevent similar errors in the future. The protagonist remained composed, understanding that closure required more than acknowledgement. It required verification and follow-through. The protagonist also reflected on the reactions of others involved, the neighbors, the company representatives, and even casual observers online. They realized that their careful, measured approach had not only solved a personal problem, but had also become a lesson in accountability. The situation demonstrated that persistence, preparation, and calm execution could compel even large organizations to respond responsibly. There was a subtle satisfaction in knowing that actions taken with care and integrity could create real change. As evening approached, the company confirmed that the bill had been corrected. Official records were updated, refunds processed, and notifications sent. The protagonist meticulously verified each detail, checking calculations and documentation to ensure nothing had been overlooked. The sense of triumph was quiet but profound. They had faced an overwhelming challenge, acted responsibly, and achieved resolution without resorting to recklessness or confrontation beyond reason. Neighbors and friends, aware of the outcome, expressed admiration and relief. The protagonist shared the story carefully, focusing on the process and lessons learned rather than dramatizing the events. There was an appreciation for the importance of standing up for oneself, of preparation, and of using evidence to support claims. It was a moment of reflection, understanding that the real achievement lay not just in correcting the bill but in demonstrating that reason, persistence, and careful action could prevail. Late into the night, the protagonist reviewed the entire sequence of events one last time. Every action, every call, every document had been recorded, ensuring a clear trail of evidence. They reflected on the intensity of the experience, the emotions involved, and the growth it had inspired. The shock of the $5,000 bill, once overwhelming, had become a catalyst for confidence, assertiveness, and careful strategic thinking. The protagonist recognized that they had discovered a strength that would serve them in many areas of life, beyond this single challenge. The day ended with a quiet satisfaction. The immediate problem was resolved. The company had acknowledged the error and corrective actions were in place. The protagonist allowed themselves a moment of rest, appreciating the calm after the intensity of the previous days. There was a clear sense of closure, a recognition that the effort had been worth it, and an understanding that vigilance and careful planning had made the difference. In the following days, the protagonist remained attentive, monitoring communications and ensuring that all adjustments were fully processed. They continued documenting any interactions, not out of fear but out of a commitment to thoroughness. Each verification reinforced the lesson that preparation and evidence-based action were powerful tools. The company, now more cautious and aware, took additional steps to prevent similar errors, highlighting the impact of the protagonist's actions. Ultimately, the protagonist realized that the experience had transformed not just their immediate situation, but also their approach to challenges. They had faced an intimidating problem, acted with intelligence and integrity, and created a resolution that was both fair and effective. The $5,000 bill had become a symbol not of frustration but of opportunity. The chance to stand up, assert control, and demonstrate that careful, responsible action could compel accountability even in large, impersonal systems. The story of this experience spread quietly, not as a tale of confrontation, but as a lesson in persistence, preparation, and careful action. The protagonist had proven that reason, evidence, and calm determination could create meaningful results. The final outcome was not only a corrected bill but also a sense of empowerment, a reaffirmation of personal agency, and a demonstration that even in frustrating, overwhelming circumstances, thoughtful action could prevail. The morning after the final corrections had been confirmed, the protagonist felt a rare sense of peace. The impossible $5,000 bill was no longer hanging over their head. The company had not only acknowledged the error but had corrected it fully and ensured that systems were in place to prevent similar mistakes in the future. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the battle had been won not with anger, but with careful planning, evidence, and persistence. They spent the early hours of the day reviewing the entire process. Every phone call, every piece of documentation, every photo of meter readings, and every calculation had been meticulously logged. Looking back, it was clear how far they had come from the moment of shock when the bill first arrived. The initial fear and disbelief had transformed into determination, then into action, and finally into resolution. Each stage had taught a valuable lesson about patience, courage, and the power of careful planning. The protagonist also reflected on the reactions of those around them. Friends and neighbors had offered support, expressed concern, and occasionally questioned the boldness of their approach. But in the end, the reactions had been mostly positive. The community had watched someone stand up to a massive, impersonal company and succeed. It was a reminder that taking responsibility, preparing thoroughly, and acting decisively could inspire others and create positive ripple effects beyond the immediate situation. Even as life returned to normal, the protagonist remained mindful of the lessons learned. They continued to check the electric bill and usage not out of fear, but as a habit reinforced by experience. The meticulous attention to detail, the importance of documenting every interaction, and the ability to stay calm under pressure had become part of their approach to challenges in general. This experience had strengthened not only their confidence but also their capacity for strategic thinking and problem solving. There was also a sense of empowerment that came from knowing that standing up for oneself was possible, even against large organizations. The protagonist realized that the ordeal had been more than a battle over a single bill. It had been a demonstration of personal agency. They had discovered that preparation, evidence, and calm determination could turn a frustrating, seemingly insurmountable problem into a manageable and ultimately victorious outcome. In the days following the resolution, the protagonist shared the story cautiously, highlighting the importance of careful preparation and persistence rather than focusing on the drama or chaos. Conversations with friends, family, and colleagues emphasized practical lessons: how to document interactions, verify facts, and take measured action. The story became a tool for teaching, an example of how intelligence and calm could triumph over bureaucracy and errors. The protagonist also reflected on the emotional journey. The initial shock had given way to frustration, then to cautious determination, and finally to satisfaction and relief. Each emotion had served a purpose, guiding decisions and sharpening focus. They recognized that emotions, when managed and channeled appropriately, could become allies in problem-solving rather than obstacles. The experience had been intense, but it had also been instructive, showing the value of self-control, patience, and strategic thinking. Looking back, the protagonist saw the sequence of events as a story of empowerment and growth. The impossible bill had been a challenge that seemed overwhelming at first, but it had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate resilience, intelligence, and accountability. The experience had reinforced the importance of standing up for oneself, of using evidence to support claims, and of acting decisively but responsibly. It was a victory grounded in preparation, logic, and persistence. The protagonist also considered the broader implications. The company, now aware of the consequences of errors, had adjusted procedures and systems to prevent similar mistakes in the future. What began as a personal struggle had led to improvements that could benefit countless other customers. The protagonist felt a quiet pride in knowing that their actions had created positive change beyond their own immediate situation. As the week progressed, life gradually returned to a calm rhythm. The protagonist continued daily routines, but with a heightened awareness of the power of preparation, documentation, and assertive action. Each small decision, each interaction, and each challenge carried a newfound confidence born from the experience. The $5,000 bill, once a symbol of fear and frustration, had become a symbol of empowerment, learning, and personal agency. Evenings were spent in quiet reflection, considering the journey from shock to resolution. The protagonist understood that the process had been intense but ultimately rewarding. They had faced an extraordinary challenge and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. The story of this experience was one of perseverance, careful planning, and the power of standing up for oneself even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, the protagonist felt a profound sense of closure. The bill had been corrected, the company had acknowledged the error, and the systems had been adjusted. Beyond the immediate resolution, there was a lasting lesson. Thoughtful action, patience, and careful documentation could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The experience had been transformative, providing practical wisdom, emotional resilience, and a quiet confidence that would last a lifetime. The protagonist understood that the story of the $5,000 bill was more than a personal victory. It was a reminder that fairness, accountability, and preparation mattered. It demonstrated that even against large, impersonal systems, individuals could assert control and achieve justice when they acted with intelligence, persistence, and responsibility. The lesson was clear. Challenges could be faced, mistakes could be corrected, and empowerment could be achieved through careful, deliberate action. As the sun set on the protagonist's journey, there was a sense of fulfillment. The impossible bill had been transformed into an opportunity for growth, learning, and change. The experience left the protagonist stronger, more confident, and more prepared for future challenges. It was a story of persistence, strategy, and human resilience, a story that would stay with them forever, not as a tale of frustration, but as a testament to the power of thoughtful, determined action in the face of adversity. The morning David decided to cut the power to Power Grid Solutions' regional office, he felt a strange mix of nervousness and satisfaction. He had spent 3 sleepless nights planning every detail. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about showing them what it felt like to be powerless, both literally and figuratively. He arrived at the industrial park where Power Grid's main operations center sat at exactly 6:47 in the morning. The building was already buzzing with activity. Through the large windows, David could see dozens of customer service representatives settling into their cubicles, computers booting up, and managers walking around with their morning coffee. Nobody noticed the middle-aged man in a utility vest and hard hat, carrying a clipboard near the electrical junction box at the edge of the property. David had done his homework. As a licensed electrical engineer, he knew exactly which systems he could legally access and which ones were off-limits. The junction box he stood in front of belonged to the building's landlord, not Power Grid themselves. A small but important detail that kept everything he was about to do on the right side of the law. He had even called the property management company the day before, posing as a concerned citizen reporting a potential electrical hazard. They had given him verbal permission to inspect it. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the metal panel. Inside was a maze of wires, circuit breakers, and connection points. To most people, it would look like complete chaos, but to David it was like reading a book. He identified the main feed lines that supplied power to the building. Then, with careful precision, he began making his modifications. He wasn't going to cut all their power. That would be too obvious and potentially dangerous. Instead, David had planned something far more creative. He installed a series of timer switches that would create random power interruptions throughout the day. Lights would flicker. Computers would lose connection. Air conditioning would cut in and out. It would be just unstable enough to cause massive problems, but not so dramatic that anyone would immediately suspect sabotage. The installation took him 23 minutes. When he finished, David closed the panel, took several photos for documentation, and walked calmly back to his truck. His heart was pounding, but his face remained expressionless. Phase 1 was complete. By 9:15 that morning, David was sitting in a coffee shop across the street from Power Grid's office, his laptop open in front of him. He had a clear view of the building's entrance. His phone was on the table, set to silent but within easy reach. He sipped his coffee slowly and waited. The first sign of trouble came at 9:47. Through the windows, he saw the interior lights flicker once, twice, then go completely dark for about 15 seconds before coming back on. David allowed himself a small smile. Then his phone buzzed. It was a notification from the online community forum where Power Grid customers complained about service issues. Someone had just posted about their customer service call being dropped mid-conversation. Over the next hour, the chaos inside Power Grid's office became increasingly visible. David watched as employees gathered in confused clusters. Managers rushed from one department to another. Through the windows, he could see computer screens going black, then rebooting, then crashing again. The pattern was random enough that nobody could predict when the next interruption would hit. At 10:30, emergency vehicles arrived. Not fire trucks or ambulances, but utility company repair vans. David watched as technicians scratched their heads and examined the building's external power connections. They found nothing wrong with the main grid supply, just as he knew they would. The problem wasn't with the power coming in. It was with how it was being distributed inside the junction box he had modified. His phone continued buzzing with notifications. The customer forum was exploding with complaints. People who had been waiting on hold for 30 minutes suddenly got disconnected. Others reported that Power Grid's website kept crashing. Several customers posted screenshots showing error messages when they tried to pay their bills online. The company's automated payment system was completely offline. David ordered a second coffee and continued watching. Around 11 a.m., he saw something that made his chest tighten with vindication. A woman in a business suit stormed out of the building, phone pressed to her ear, visibly frustrated. She was gesturing wildly as she spoke, her professional composure completely shattered. David recognized her from the news articles he had found during his research. She was Patricia Vance, the regional operations director, the same person whose signature appeared on the letter denying his appeal. The power interruptions continued throughout the lunch hour. David could see office workers standing outside the building, unable to work, looking confused and irritated. Some were on their phones, probably trying to explain to customers why their calls kept dropping. Others sat on the curb eating their lunches early because there was nothing else they could do. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, David noticed something interesting. A news van pulled into the parking lot. A reporter and camera operator got out and began filming the building. Someone must have tipped off the media about Power Grid's technical difficulties. David felt a surge of satisfaction. The story was spreading beyond just frustrated customers. He opened his laptop and checked the local news website. Sure enough, there was already a breaking news alert about widespread service disruptions at Power Grid Solutions. The article mentioned that customers across the region were unable to reach customer service, and that the company's online systems were experiencing major outages. The comment section was filling up fast with people sharing their own Power Grid horror stories. David thought about the $5,000 bill sitting on his kitchen counter. He thought about the hours he had spent on hold, being transferred from one unhelpful representative to another. He thought about the condescending tone in Patricia Vance's voice when she told him there was nothing they could do. And he thought about how they had threatened to destroy his credit rating over a mistake they had made. His phone rang. It was Mrs. Morrison, his neighbor. David answered quietly, still keeping his eyes on the Power Grid building. "David, are you watching the news?" she asked, excitement in her voice.
Power Grid is having a complete meltdown.
"Their whole system is down. People are saying it might be a cyber attack or something." "I saw something about that," David replied carefully. "Isn't it wonderful? Maybe now they'll understand what it feels like when their customers can't get any help. Karma is real, David. Karma is definitely real." After hanging up, David allowed himself a moment of genuine pleasure. Mrs. Morrison was right about karma, even if she didn't know the full story. But David knew this was only the beginning. The power interruptions would continue for the rest of the day. Tomorrow he had plans for Phase 2. He packed up his laptop and left the coffee shop. As he walked past the Power Grid building, he could see technicians still working frantically, trying to figure out what was wrong. They would eventually find his modifications, of course. But by then the damage would be done. The company's reputation would take a serious hit. Customers would lose trust. And maybe, just maybe, they would think twice before treating their next customer like David had been treated. Driving home, David felt lighter than he had in weeks. He wasn't a vengeful person by nature, but sometimes when the system fails you, you have to create your own justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new plans, and new ways to make Power Grid understand the consequences of their actions. For now, though, David was content knowing that somewhere in that chaotic office building, people were finally experiencing the frustration and helplessness he had felt. The war wasn't over, but today, he had won an important battle. The phone call came at 7:32 in the morning, 3 days after David had sabotaged Power Grid's office building. He was pouring his first cup of coffee when his cell phone lit up with an unknown number. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of him. "This is David Chen," he answered, keeping his voice neutral. "Mr. Chen, this is Gerald Blackwood. I'm the Vice President of Customer Relations at Power Grid Solutions." The voice on the other end sounded tired and defeated. "I apologize for calling so early, but we need to speak with you urgently about your account and several other matters." David felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I've tried speaking with your company multiple times, Mr. Blackwood. Nobody seemed interested in listening." There was a long pause on the other end. "Yes, I've reviewed your case file, along with the recordings of your calls. And I want to start by saying that what happened to you was completely unacceptable. We made serious errors, and you were treated poorly when you tried to resolve them." "That's putting it mildly," David said, sitting down at his kitchen table. "You people tried to charge me $5,000 for electricity I didn't use. Then you threatened to ruin my credit when I refused to pay for your mistake. I understand your anger, Mr. Chen, I really do." Gerald's voice was sincere, not the scripted corporate tone David had heard from every other Power Grid employee. "But I need to be direct with you. We've been experiencing significant operational problems over the past few days. Technical issues that have cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars and damaged our reputation. Our IT department has traced some of these issues to unauthorized modifications made to our building's electrical systems." David said nothing. He sipped his coffee and waited. "The modifications were very sophisticated," Gerald continued, "made by someone with extensive electrical engineering knowledge. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and how to avoid breaking any laws while causing maximum disruption." "Sounds like you have a serious problem," David replied carefully. "We do, and we also noticed something interesting in our security camera footage. A man matching your description was seen near our electrical junction box on the morning the problems began, wearing a utility vest and carrying proper identification. Very professional looking." David's heart was pounding now, but he kept his voice steady. "Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," Gerald said quickly. "Because technically you didn't do anything illegal. You had permission from the property management company to inspect that junction box. You're a licensed electrical engineer, so you had every right to be there. And the modifications you made were to the building landlord's equipment, not ours. Very clever, actually. Then why are you calling me?" Gerald sighed deeply. "Because I want to propose a solution that works for everyone. We both know what happened here. You were wronged by our company. Our billing system made a catastrophic error. Our customer service failed you, and our management refused to listen when you tried to fix it through proper channels. So you took matters into your own hands." "I'm listening," David said. "Here's what I'm offering. First, we immediately zero out your account. The $5,000 charge disappears completely. Second, we credit your account $5,000 for future electricity use. That's roughly 3 years of free power for you. Third, we issue a formal written apology acknowledging our errors. And fourth, we pay you a consulting fee of $15,000 to help us identify and fix the systemic problems that led to your situation." David almost dropped his coffee cup. "That's a very generous offer.